The wedding was 37 minutes away when I found the shoe was gone. I know the exact number because I'd been counting down all morning on the kitchen clock above the servants' pantry. The one with the chipped enamel face that nobody but me had ever bothered to look at twice. Everyone else in the Moretti estate kept time by the string quartet warming up in the ballroom, or the caterers shouting about ice sculptures melting in the July heat, or the bride's mother screaming about a missing veil 3 floors up. I kept time by a clock nobody trusted, in a house where nobody trusted me either. I'd folded my last uniform an hour ago, fired that morning. No explanation, no severance. Just a folded slip of paper slid under my door, and a cardboard box left outside like I was a delivery being returned. 4 years of scrubbing marble I wasn't allowed to walk across barefoot. 4 years of memorizing which stair creaked and which door stuck in humidity. And it ended with a note I didn't even get to read in front of a person. So I knelt down to get the one thing in this house that was actually mine. The wooden box under my bed, wrapped in a yellowed cloth I hadn't opened in 6 years, because I already knew what was inside, and I wasn't sure I could survive looking at it again on a day that had already taken everything else from me. It was still there. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the footsteps behind me. Heavy, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who has never once in his life needed to knock on a door before entering it. Adrian Moretti didn't come to say goodbye. Men like him didn't say goodbye to maids. He came, I assumed, to make sure I hadn't slicked a silver spoon into my suitcase on the way out. That was the kind of man everyone in this house told me he was. Cold, precise. A man who checked the corners of a room the way other men checked locks, because he trusted nothing he hadn't verified himself. He knelt down exactly where I'd just been kneeling, reached under the bed, like he didn't believe I'd looked properly. His hand found the box before I could stop him. He opened it. I watched his face do something I had never once seen it do in 4 years of passing him. In hallways he pretended not to see me. It broke, because I'd been keeping, under my bed, in a house I'd cleaned for 4 years without ever understanding whose house it truly was, the exact twin of a shoe he had buried inside an empty coffin. He didn't ask me anything. He didn't yell. He simply stood, turned, and walked out of my room. Past the caterers balancing trays of champagne flutes, past the archway dripping in white roses, past his own bride, adjusting her veil in a hallway mirror, and into a ballroom filled with 300 guests who had come to watch him get married. He held up one small pink shoe so that every single one of them could see it, and he said 4 words that stopped a wedding cold. This isn't over yet. The music died mid-note. I heard it from the top of the staircase. The violin bow dragging into silence like something had physically reached out and grabbed it. I didn't understand what was happening. I still don't think, in that moment, I fully understood what I was holding, what that shoe had cast and who it belonged to, and how close I had come to walking out of that house forever, with the answer to a 6-year-old tragedy zipped inside my suitcase. Let me go back. 4 years is a long time to be invisible on purpose. That's what the job required, really. Not cleaning, not really. Invisibility. You learn to walk through a room without disturbing the air in it. You learn which staff eat lunch together, and which ones you don't sit near unless invited. You learn that the housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Renata, has a way of saying your name that makes it sound like an apology you owe her. Emma, again with the streaks on the west windows, said flat, said like fact. The other girls would look at their shoes when she did it, not because they pitied me, but because nobody wants to be looked at when someone else is being cut down. I let it land. I always let it land, because a room in the attic and a paycheck that arrived on time were worth more to me than whatever was left of my pride. Or, so I told myself, most nights, folding towels that cost more than my monthly wage. What none of them knew, what I made sure none of them ever learned, was that I hadn't always folded towels for a living. Before the Moretti estate, before Renata's flat voice and the attic room with the window that didn't fully close, I had spent 2 years at St. Catherine's, a maternity shelter that took in frightened young mothers with nowhere else to go. I had held more newborns in that building than most women hold in a lifetime. I had learned a particular hush that falls over a room when a baby finally stops crying and simply breathes. I never told anyone here, not because it was a secret worth keeping, but because the woman who left St. Catherine's wasn't someone I let myself think about anymore. She'd failed at the one thing she was supposed to be good at. And failure, when it's bad enough, doesn't just take away your job. It takes away your right to talk about what you used to be. As for Adrian Moretti, the man whose wedding I had just accidentally detonated, I knew exactly as much about him as any maid was permitted to know, which was almost nothing at all. He was feared. He was precise. He never smiled, not even in the family portraits that lined the east staircase. He still wore a wedding ring, though the staff whispered his wife had been gone for years, and there was one room on the second floor that no member of staff, not Renata, not the senior housekeeper, not anyone, was ever allowed to enter. I used to wonder, dusting the hallway outside that door, what a man like that could possibly still be protecting. Now I knew, somewhere behind me, in a ballroom gone silent, Adrian Moretti stood in front of everyone he'd ever done business with, holding a shoe that should not have existed, whispering to no one in particular, "It cannot exist." But it did. And I was the one who'd been keeping it safe. 6 years before that shoe stopped a wedding, I didn't know the name Moretti at all. I was 27, and I spent my evenings at St. Catherine's, a maternity shelter tucked behind a church in a part of the city where nobody photographed the buildings for postcards. I wasn't paid for the work. I didn't need to be. I showed up 3 nights a week because there was a particular kind of quiet that settled over me when I held a newborn, a quiet I couldn't find anywhere else in my life. I loved those babies the way you love something you've decided. Privately, you'll never be allowed to keep. I wasn't married. There was no one waiting for me at home to make a family with, but I used to lie awake some nights and let myself imagine it anyway. A house with a crib in it. A child who called me something other than my name. Foster care, maybe, someday. Once I'd saved enough, once I'd proven to whatever committee decided these things that a woman alone could still be enough for a child who needed one, I never got the chance to prove it. Not the way I imagined. The rain that night was the kind that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive all at once. No gradual build-up, just a wall of water against the shelter's windows by 9 o'clock. Drumming so hard on the tin awning over the side door that Sister Agnes joked we'd need a boat by morning. I remember laughing at that. I remember it because it was the last thing that felt ordinary for a long time. The knock came just after 11, not the shelter's usual knock. The soft, apologetic tap of a frightened girl, unsure if she's allowed to ask for help. This was fast, frantic. 3 hits, then silence. Then 3 more, like whoever was on the other side had already looked back over her shoulder twice before I even reached the door. She was young, younger than me, soaked through, hair plastered flat against a face that had the particular grey pallor of someone who hadn't slept in days. She was cradling a bundle against her chest so tightly I thought at first she was protecting herself from the rain. Then the bundle moved, and I heard the thin, healthy cry of a newborn. "I need you to take her," the woman said. Not please, not an introduction. Just that, flat and urgent, like she'd rehearsed it the whole way here and didn't trust herself to say anything more. I brought them both inside. I remember my hands going to work before my mind caught up, checking the baby's color, her breathing, the way her tiny fists opened and closed against the cold. She was healthy, beautiful even, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that were already trying to focus on the light above her. And on her feet, tied with a small satin bow, were the most extraordinary pair of baby shoes I had ever seen. Hand-stitched, pale pink, with tiny embroidered flowers along the seam. The kind of careful, loving work that takes someone hours to finish. Nothing you could buy in a shop. Nothing anyone would make for a child they didn't already love beyond reason. "What's her name?" I asked. The woman flinched like I'd struck her. Don't ask me anything. Just keep her safe, please. I need to know who to contact. A father, a family member. There isn't time." She was already backing toward the door, eyes darting to the rain-streaked window, to the dark street beyond it. "They're coming." I didn't understand the words then. I thought she meant a husband, a family that disapproved. I had no framework, at 27, soft-handed and well-meaning, for what those 2 words actually meant. She was gone before I could stop her, out into the rain, running. Not towards shelter, but away from it, like the storm itself was safer than staying in one place too long. I held that baby for 3 hours before I understood. The gunfire started a little after 2. Not a single shot. A burst of them, fast and overlapping, followed by shouting in a language I recognized but couldn't place fast enough. Sister Agnes grabbed my arm and said one word, "Go," and I understood it, the way you understand things. Your body decides before your mind does. I ran with the baby pressed against my chest the way that woman had held her, one hand cradling her head, and I went out the back stairwell into an alley that smelled like wet stone and gasoline. There were men in the courtyard, masked, moving in formation, fast, methodical, checking doorways like they were hunting something specific. I understood, with a clarity that still visits me in the worst of my dreams, that the something specific was the child in my arms. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember the alley narrowing, headlights sweeping across brick, a car door slamming somewhere too close. I remember smoke, from what I never learned, thick enough to burn my throat. I remember a hand grabbing for my shoulder and twisting away from it hard enough that my feet went out from under me on the wet cobblestone. I fell. The impact knocked the breath out of me, and for one suspended second, the kind of second that stretches itself into a lifetime, my arms were empty. I don't know how she left them. I don't know if she was pulled from me, or if I lost my grip in the fall, or if some larger hand simply reached down and took what it had come for. I only know that when I pushed myself up off the ground, gasping, soaked, screaming a name I'd never even gotten to learn, there was no baby in the alley, no cry, no small warm weight anywhere in the smoke and the dark. Only one shoe in my open hand, where I must have been holding it without realizing. I searched until the sky turned grey. I searched doorways, gutters, the backs of parked cars, every inch of that alley, and the 3 streets beyond it, calling out for a child whose name I never knew, until my voice gave out and the sun came up on a street that had already forgotten anything happened there at all. I never found her. I told myself, in the years after, every possible version of what might have happened, that someone had taken her to safety, that she was alive somewhere, loved, unaware. But grief doesn't let you keep the kind version for long. Most nights, I believed, the truth was simpler and worse. I kept the shoe, not as proof of anything. I had nothing to prove, and no one to prove it to. I kept it as punishment, a small, soft thing to remind me every time I saw it, that I'd been given the one job that mattered more than any other I would ever have, and I had failed it in 11 minutes of rain and smoke. I only think now, looking back, of the last thing that woman said to me, not to my face but into the dark right before she vanished into the rain, as if she already knew how the night would end. If anyone survives, tell Adrian, I'm sorry. I didn't know his wife's name yet, standing in that ruined room with a wedding collapsing downstairs. I would learn it later, in pieces, the way you learn the shape of a wound by watching someone else flinch when you touch near it. But I need to tell you now, because you deserve to understand what that little shoe meant to the man holding it, what it cost him long before it ever cost me anything. Her name was Sophia. 9 years before that wedding day, she had married Adrian Moretti in this same house, in a ceremony half the size of the one he'd nearly walked into that morning, because Sophia had never wanted spectacle. She wanted a garden and good wine and her husband looking at her like she was the only person in the room. By every account I ever heard, he had. When she became pregnant, she didn't ask for anything from the nurseries in Milan or the boutiques that would have gladly outfitted an entire childhood on the Moretti name alone. She taught herself to sew instead, badly at first. From what I'm told, crooked stitches, uneven soles. A first attempt Adrian kept in a drawer for years because she'd nearly cried laughing at how lopsided it turned out. But she kept at it, night after night, in the last months of her pregnancy, until she'd made something worth keeping. A single pair of pink baby shoes, hand-stitched, embroidered along the seam with small flowers she'd copied from a pattern in her own mother's wedding veil. Only one pair. She never made another. She used to say the second pair would ruin the meaning of the first. Isabella Moretti was born on the spring morning, 7 pounds even, with her mother's dark hair, and, according to the one photograph I ever saw of that day, her father's stubborn frown already fixed on her face. Sophia dressed her in those shoes before anyone else had even held her. For 4 months, Adrian Moretti was, by every description I later heard from people who'd known him then, an entirely different man, softer, slower to anger, a man who cancelled meetings to watch his daughter sleep. Then came the convoy. I don't know all the details even now. Adrian never told the story the same way twice, and I never pushed him to. What I understand is this: a rival family, or someone posing as one, ambushed the cars moving Sophia and Isabella between properties during a routine transfer. Gunfire. Chaos. A driver who didn't survive long enough to explain what he'd seen. Sophia was found near the wreckage, having clearly used the last of whatever time she had shielding her daughter's empty car seat with her own body. Isabella was never found. Not a body, not a trace. Only weeks later, discovered half buried in mud near the site, a single pink shoe, the twin of the one that would end up beneath my bed 6 years later, brought to me by a woman I never got a name for. Adrian buried that shoe inside a coffin with nothing else in it. Everyone in his life, his mother, his advisors, the priest who presided over a funeral for a body that didn't exist, told him gently at first, and then less gently, that grief has a shelf life, that he had an empire to run, that he needed to let his daughter rest. He kept his wedding ring on for a wife who wasn't in his bed anymore, and he never opened the door to a room down the hall from ours that none of the staff were permitted to enter, because I would learn eventually that it was Isabella's nursery kept exactly as Sophia had left it. That was the man standing in my doorway with my 6-year-old shoe in his hand. He didn't shout. I want that understood clearly, because everyone in that house had warned me in whispers over the years about what Adrian Moretti looked like when he was angry. This wasn't that. This was something quieter and infinitely more frightening, a stillness that came from a place past anger entirely. "Where did you get this?" he asked. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I felt it in my chest. The way you feel a door closing in another room. I couldn't lie to him. I don't think I could have lied to anyone in that moment, but especially not to him, not with his hand shaking almost imperceptibly around a shoe he clearly recognized on sight. So I told him everything. St. Catherine's, the rainy night, the frightened woman who wouldn't give her name, the gunfire, the alley, the 11 minutes that ended with an empty pair of arms and one small shoe left behind. I told him about the years I'd spent believing I'd let a child die because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't enough of anything to keep her safe. I was crying before I finished. Not delicate crying, the kind that comes up from somewhere old, somewhere I'd kept locked for 6 years because there had never been anyone to tell. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't offer excuses. There weren't any to offer. I had lost a child that wasn't mine to lose, and I had spent 6 years punishing myself quietly in a house I didn't even know belonged to a father. Adrian didn't speak for a long moment. When I finally looked up at him, his expression had changed. The fury I'd expected wasn't there anymore. Something else had replaced it. Understanding, maybe. Or the particular kind of grief that recognizes itself in someone else's face. "You didn't know," he said. "It wasn't a question. You've been carrying this for 6 years and you never even knew whose child she was." I shook my head. I hadn't known his name until that morning. I hadn't known there was a Moretti connected to any of it. I had simply carried a shoe and a wound, in silence, in an attic room 3 floors above the nursery that belonged to the daughter I'd lost. And then, because grief does strange things to memory, because some details bury themselves until the right pressure finally brings them back up, I remembered something I hadn't thought of in 6 years. The woman at St. Catherine's hadn't only said, "They're coming." She'd said one more thing, right before she vanished into the rain, a name I'd let dissolve into the noise of that night because it meant nothing to me at the time. It wasn't Adrian's name. It was someone else's. Someone I would soon learn that Adrian trusted with his life. The name sat between us in that small attic room for a long moment before either of us said anything. "Say it again," Adrian said. Quiet, careful, the way you'd ask someone to repeat something you were hoping you'd misheard. "Luca," I said. She said, "Tell Adrian," and then she said Luca's sorry. I didn't understand it then. I didn't know either name meant anything. I held on to it because it was the last thing she said before she disappeared. I watched something move behind his eyes, fast and violent, gone before it fully surfaced. He didn't explain who Luca was. He didn't need to. I would learn the rest of it over the following days, in pieces, the way you learn the architecture of a house by watching which doors a person avoids walking past. Luca DeSantis had been at Adrian's side since they were boys running errands for their fathers in the same narrow streets. He'd stood beside Adrian at his wedding to Sophia. He'd been the one who carried Adrian out of the hospital the night Isabella was born, too drunk on joy and champagne to drive himself home. He was second in command of the entire Moretti organization, the man Adrian trusted with the keys to everything he owned, everything he loved, everything he was. Practically a brother. The word alone should have ended the conversation. It should have been impossible. And yet, Adrian didn't dismiss it. He didn't laugh it off. or tell me I'd misremembered a stranger's dying words on the worst night of my life. He went very still instead, the way a man goes still when a door he'd nailed shut years ago has just creaked open on its own. By the next morning, the estate had changed shape entirely. The wedding wasn't postponed so much as it simply ceased to exist as a topic anyone was permitted to raise. His fiancée, a woman I'd only ever seen from a distance, elegant and composed even in the chaos of that ruined ceremony, was told there had been a family emergency. I don't know what explanation she was given. I only know that within a day, the flowers were gone from the ballroom, the caterers paid and dismissed, and the entire house had gone quiet in a way I'd never experienced in 4 years of living inside its walls. The council meeting Adrian had scheduled for that week, the kind of meeting I would later understand that men flew in from 3 countries to attend, was cancelled with 2 lines in an email. A shipping deal worth more than I'd earn in 100 lifetimes was allowed to stall without explanation. Security rotations patrol schedules, the entire quiet machinery that kept the estate and everyone in it safe, were all handed off temporarily to men Adrian trusted least, because the men he trusted most were the ones he could no longer be sure of. His entire empire waited, and Adrian spent that waiting locked in the study below the nursery, going through records nobody had touched in 6 years. I wasn't asked to help. I want to be honest about that. Nobody handed me a badge or a title. But I was the only living person who'd been inside that maternity shelter the night. Everything happened, and Adrian, I think, had learned enough in one conversation to know that keeping me close was safer than sending me away with what I knew. So I stayed, not as a maid anymore, though nobody had told me what I was instead. The records told a strange, careful story once someone finally started pulling at its threads. The hospital that would have processed Isabella's death, had there been a body to process, had no consistent file. Adrian found 3 different versions of an incident report, each contradicting the last, each stamped by a different administrator, none of whom still worked there. The original police report from the convoy attack had been amended twice in the weeks following the incident, softening details, removing a witness statement that had originally described the attackers as wearing gear inconsistent with any rival family's known crew. 2 of the officers who'd responded to the scene that night were dead within 18 months. 1 in a car accident, 1 in what was ruled a suicide, though Adrian, reading the file with his jaw tight and his hands very still on the desk, didn't say what he thought of that ruling out loud. This wasn't an attack, he said finally, more to himself than to me. This was staged. Someone built this to look like a rival hit, and they were thorough enough that I never once questioned it. Not for 6 years. I didn't have his resources. I didn't have files or contacts or the kind of money that makes locked doors open. What I had was memory, and memory, it turned out, was worth more than either of us expected. Late one night, unable to sleep in the guest room he'd quietly moved me into, I found a pencil and a pad of paper, and I tried to draw the alley, not from feeling. I'd spent 6 years drowning in the feeling of that night, but from detail. The way I used to chart a delivery room when something felt wrong, and I needed to slow my racing mind down into something concrete. I drew the cobblestone, the car doors, the shape of the men in the smoke, hooded, moving in formation, and on the sleeve of the one who'd grabbed for my shoulder before I fell, a symbol, small, stitched into the fabric near the cuff, something I hadn't consciously registered that night, but which my hand, apparently, had never forgotten. I brought the sketch to Adrian the next morning. He went very quiet looking at it, and then he pulled up something on his laptop, a security contract, a company logo, and turned the screen toward me. The symbol was identical. That's DeSantis Protective Services, he said. Luca's company. His men wear that patch on every uniform they own. Neither of us said anything for a long time after that. There wasn't anything left to argue against. The man Adrian had trusted with his life, his wife's memory, his daughter's shoe buried in an empty coffin. That man's own people had been in the alley the night Isabella vanished. We might have sat with that horror a while longer, might have let it settle into something we could plan around, if the phone on Adrian's desk hadn't rung 2 days later with a number neither of us recognized. It was a woman's voice, older, hesitant, like she'd rehearsed the call 100 times, and still wasn't sure she should be making it. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "you don't know me. I used to work records at the hospital years ago. I should have called sooner. I've spent 6 years telling myself it wasn't my business. Adrian's hand tightened around the phone. "I need you to hear this," she said. "Your daughter, the baby from the attack. I processed intake for the maternity ward that entire year, every file, every record." She paused. "Mr. Moretti, there was never a death certificate issued for Isabella Moretti because your baby never died." Nobody spoke for what felt like a long time after that phone call ended. Adrian set the receiver down slowly, like it had gotten heavier in his hand, and I watched him stare at nothing for a full minute before he said anything at all. "6 years, he said finally. 6 years I mourned a child who might have been alive the entire time, and the man I would have trusted to guard her with his life is the reason I never knew. I didn't have comfort to offer him. What comfort was there? I understood grief that reorganizes itself into something worse than what it replaced. I'd lived inside a version of that for 6 years myself, believing I'd let a baby die in an alley when the truth, however buried, was crueler and stranger than my guilt had ever imagined. That night, unable to sleep in the guest room, that still didn't feel like it belonged to me. I went back to the box under what used to be my bed. I'd already emptied it once, the day the shoe was found. Laid every piece of that old life out on the attic floor, while Adrian watched with an expression I still didn't fully understand. But grief makes you careless the first time you go looking through the wreckage of a memory, and I hadn't checked everything. There was a second cloth bundle tucked into the seam of the box's lining, one I'd forgotten existed. I'd wrapped it there myself 6 years ago, in the numb days after the alley, and then apparently buried the memory of doing it along with everything else I couldn't carry. Inside it was a photograph. It had been taken at St. Catherine's, that much I recognized immediately. The shelter's chipped blue door was visible in the corner of the frame, along with the edge of the awning, where the rain had been hammering that night. I didn't remember anyone taking it. I must have had a disposable camera at the shelter, but donor records the kind Sister Agnes used to document intake for the parish files. And someone, maybe even me, on some instinct, I couldn't recall, had captured a single frame in the chaos of that night. It showed the moment just before everything fell apart. The frightened young mother half turned toward the door, the baby held against her chest, and behind her, barely in frame, a man in the doorway, face turned away from the camera, one arm reaching toward her. At first, none of us saw anything unusual. Adrian turned the photograph over in his hands the next morning, jaw tight, looking for a face he could identify, and found nothing. The angle was wrong, the man's features lost in shadow and motion blur. It was Adrian who noticed the bracelet. He went very still, the same stillness I'd learned by then to recognize as the moment before something in him broke open. He held the photograph closer to the window light, and I watched his thumb trace the edge of the image, right where the man's forearm crossed into frame. "That bracelet," he said, and his voice had gone strange, flattened, like he was forcing the words out through something tightening in his chest. "That's not costume jewelry. That's not something you buy." He explained it to me slowly, like a man reciting facts to keep himself from feeling them. The Moretti family had one heirloom that predated even his grandfather. A heavy gold bracelet engraved with the family crest, passed down not by blood, but by trust, given only to the man closest to the head of the family. Adrian's father had given it to his own second-in-command, and Adrian, years ago, had given it to the person he trusted more than anyone alive outside his own bloodline. "I gave that bracelet to Luca," he said, "at Isabella's christening. I told him he was as much her family as I was." The man in the photograph, arm outstretched toward a terrified young mother and a newborn who would vanish into gunfire and smoke within hours, was wearing it. There was no more room left for doubt after that. What followed wasn't investigation so much as excavation. Adrian and the handful of men he still trusted absolutely tearing back 6 years of carefully maintained silence, one document at a time. They found accounts under names that led through 3 shell companies and a lawyer who suddenly remembered a prior commitment in another country, back to Luca, payments to the hospital records office, timed just weeks after Isabella's disappearance. That matched almost exactly to the day the original incident report had been quietly amended. A death certificate filed for an infant with no accompanying medical examination, something that should have been impossible, and had only become possible because the man overseeing hospital security contracts that year had been Luca's own company, the coffin Adrian had buried 6 years ago. The one holding nothing but a single pink shoe and 6 years of grief he'd never let go of, had been arranged and paid for by the same man who stood beside him at the funeral with his hand on Adrian's shoulder, murmuring condolences he must have known even then were built on a lie. He staged all of it, Adrian said, and for the first time since I'd met him, I heard something in his voice that wasn't cold precision. It was closer to devastation. The attack, the death, my wife. He stopped himself there, and I didn't push him to finish it. Some sentences aren't meant to be completed out loud. I should have felt only fear, hearing all of it. Fear of a man capable of orchestrating that much loss and wearing grief for it convincingly enough to fool his oldest friend for 6 years. But what I felt instead sitting in that study surrounded by falsified documents and a bracelet that had betrayed its own meaning was something closer to dread on Adrian's behalf, because I understood even before he said it, that a man who had already destroyed one family to protect a secret wouldn't hesitate to protect it again. We didn't know yet how quickly Luca would learn we'd reopened the investigation. We didn't know he had eyes inside the estate that Adrian, even now, hadn't fully accounted for. A man who'd built his entire career on knowing things before anyone else did. But 3 days after the photographs surfaced in a house on the other side of the city, Luca DeSantis stepped down a phone call that had lasted less than 90 seconds and looked at the man standing across from him with an expression that had nothing warm left in it at all. "The maid found something," he said quietly. "It's time we made sure she doesn't find anything else." I didn't know that evening that anyone was watching the estate's east gate. I only knew that Adrian had asked me to walk the garden path to the guest cottage instead of taking the main drive. Something about the security rotation being thin that night while half his men were still verifying documents in the city. I heard the car before I saw it. Wrong sound for the estate's usual traffic. No crunch of gravel slowing for the gate, just an engine accelerating where it shouldn't have been accelerating at all. Headlights swinging wide across the hedgerow toward the footpath instead of the drive. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember the same instinct that had once carried me down a smoke-filled alley with a stranger's baby in my arms taking over again faster than thought, throwing me sideways into the boxwood hedge. A half second before the car clipped the exact space I'd been standing in, I hit the ground hard. I heard the car's tires tear up wet grass as it fought to turn around for a second pass, and I heard over the ringing in my own ears someone shouting my name from the direction of the main house. Adrian reached me before the car did. I don't know how he closed that distance so fast. I only know that one moment I was scrambling backward through the hedge with nowhere left to go, and the next Adrian was between me and the headlights, a gun in his hand I hadn't known he was carrying, firing 2 shots into the dark that sent the car swerving hard enough to clip the stone gatepost before it screamed off down the road. The silence afterward was worse than the noise had been. He knelt down in the wet grass and put both hands on my shoulders, checking me the way I imagine he once checked a patient's vitals. No, that was my instinct, not his. But he had the same urgency in his hands, running them over my arms, my face like he needed physical proof. I was still whole. "I'm all right," I said. Then my voice didn't sound like it believed itself. "You're not all right. You almost." He stopped. I watched him fight for control the way I'd watched him fight for it, in the attic room, in the study, over every file that had rewritten his understanding of the last 6 years. But this time it didn't fully come. "I did this," he said. "I brought you into this house's war, and I nearly got you killed for it." "You didn't do this," I said. "Luca did." He looked at me for a long moment, still kneeling in the grass, and something in his expression shifted into something I hadn't seen from him before. Not the coldness the staff whispered about, not even the grief I'd watched him carry through every conversation about his daughter. Something quieter. "You were never my enemy," he said. "I want you to hear me say that. Whatever you believe about yourself, whatever guilt you've been carrying for 6 years, you were never the person who took anything from me. You were the only person who never stopped trying to bring her home." I didn't have words for what that did to something I'd kept locked shut inside myself for 6 years. I only nodded and let him help me up, and understood without either of us saying it, that something between us had changed in that garden that wouldn't unchange again. 3 nights later, the ballroom that should have hosted his wedding hosted something else entirely. Adrian had summoned every council leader, every capo, every man whose loyalty mattered to the structure of his world, under the pretense of a rescheduled celebration. The guests who arrived in evening wear, expecting champagne and an apology for the earlier disruption, found instead rows of chairs facing a single table where Adrian laid out, piece by piece, 6 years of buried truth. The hospital records went first. The falsified death certificate, the inconsistent incident reports, the payments traced back through shell companies to accounts Luca had never expected anyone to find. Then, the photograph. The bracelet caught mid-frame on a stranger's arm, reaching for a terrified mother's child. Then the woman from hospital records, brought in under careful protection, testifying in a small, steady voice about a death certificate she'd been paid to file for a child who had never died. Then, last, the pink shoe itself, placed on the table where 300 guests could see it, small and impossibly ordinary against the weight of everything it had come to mean. Luca stood near the back of the room through most of it, and I watched him understand, piece by piece alongside everyone else, that there was no version of this evening that ended with his silence protected. When Adrian finally turned to him directly, the room went as still as that hallway had gone the morning he'd stopped his own wedding. "Tell me I'm wrong," Adrian said. Luca didn't. I think in the end that was the worst part for Adrian. Not the evidence itself, but watching the man he'd called a brother simply stop fighting, as if some part of him had been waiting 6 years to finally set down what he'd been carrying. "I staged it," Luca said, quietly at first, and then with something almost like relief in his voice. "The attack, the convoy. I needed you distracted. Needed the council to doubt your judgment after you lost everything at once. It wasn't supposed to go as far as it did. Sophia wasn't supposed to." He stopped himself, and for one moment something that looked like genuine grief crossed his face before he buried it again. "I never meant for it to cost you everything. Where is she?" Adrian's voice had dropped to something almost unrecognizable. "Where is Isabella?" And there, finally, Luca's composure held. "I don't know," he said. "I handed her to someone that night, and I made sure I never learned where she went. That was the point, Adrian, so that no matter what happened to me, you'd never be able to trace it back to her." Adrian's hands closed into fists at his sides, and for a moment I thought the room might see something no council meeting had ever contained. But he didn't move. He only stood there, absorbing a truth that gave him everything and nothing at once. His daughter's fate confirmed alive, and utterly, deliberately unreachable. I felt the old guilt rising in my chest before I could stop it. The same guilt that had followed me for 6 years, whispering that I should have held on tighter, run faster, done something, anything differently in that alley. Adrian turned and found me in the crowd before I could retreat into it. "Don't," he said, quiet enough that it was only for me. "Don't you dare blame yourself in this room. You didn't steal my daughter. You spent 6 years trying to find her when everyone else in your life had already told you to let it go." You to my voice enough to answer him. It was one of Adrian's investigators stepping through the ballroom doors just as the room began to fracture into shouting council members and Luca's men being quietly disarmed at the exits, who brought the evening's final piece of evidence, a single folder hastily assembled that he pressed directly into Adrian's hands. "There's something else," the investigator said. "Financial records. Someone has been making anonymous payments every month for 18 years, supporting a young woman's education, housing, medical care, all of it completely untraceable until tonight." Adrian opened the folder. 18 years, he said slowly, and I watched the number land on him like a physical weight. Isabella would be 18 this year. They took Luca out through the servants' entrance, not the front doors, which felt like its own quiet judgment. A man who'd spent 30 years walking through the main hall like he owned it, escorted out through the passage reserved for people the house pretended not to see. He didn't fight it. He hadn't fought any of it. Not really. Not since the moment Adrian asked him to tell him he was wrong, and he couldn't. The council scattered that night in a dozen directions, some loyal to Adrian, some suddenly reconsidering old alliances now that the man they'd trusted beside him for decades had been revealed as the architect of his greatest tragedy. I understood, watching from the edge of that ruined ballroom, that whatever came next for Adrian's world was going to take months, maybe years to settle. That wasn't my business to sort out. I was only the maid who'd found a shoe. Or so I told myself, packing my few belongings back into the same suitcase I'd carried down from the attic. On the morning this had all started, It felt strange, folding those same few dresses again, knowing everything that had happened between the first time I'd packed that bag and now. But I didn't know what place I had in this house once the truth had finished unraveling. I wasn't staff anymore. Nobody had asked me to clean a single surface in weeks. I wasn't family. I was, if I was honest with myself, a woman who had wandered into someone else's tragedy and helped crack it open. And now that the cracking was done, I didn't know what reason I had left to stay. I was at the bottom of the main staircase, suitcase in hand, when Adrian found me. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked. And there was something almost startled in his voice, like the idea genuinely hadn't occurred to him. "You have your answers now," I said. "About Luca, about the attack. You don't need me standing around the house anymore." "I don't need you." He said it slowly, testing the words like he wanted to make sure I heard exactly what he meant and didn't mean. "Emma, I have never once in 6 years had anyone hand me a piece of the truth about my daughter. You handed me the first one without even knowing what you were carrying. You've been handing me pieces of it ever since." He shook his head. "You don't work for me. You never should have been made to feel like a person I could simply let walk out a door." I didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had ever spoken to me like I mattered inside that house. Not in 4 years of cleaning it. Not in the 6 years before that spent grieving a child I never knew I'd have reason to grieve twice. He didn't order me to stay. That was the part that undid me, more than anything else he could have said. A man with the authority to command an entire organization simply asked plainly, like it cost him something to ask it at all, "Please don't go." He gathered the household staff 2 days later. Not the council, not his business associates, just the people who'd walked past me in hallways for 4 years without truly seeing me. Renata was there, arms folded, waiting, I think, for some kind of scandal to unfold. Instead, Adrian stood in the same ballroom that had hosted both a cancelled wedding and Luca's unmasking, and introduced me to a room full of people who had known my name only as something to be corrected. "This is Emma Collins," he said. "Some of you have known her for 4 years and never once asked what she carried with her before she came to this house. She is the woman who never stopped searching for my daughter, long before she understood whose daughter she was searching for. I owe her more than this house can repay. You'll treat her accordingly." I didn't think I'd ever felt heat rise to my face quite like that. Standing in front of people who used to speak my name like an apology owed to someone else. Afterward, when the room had emptied, I went upstairs to the attic room I'd once called mine and retrieved the small wooden box, still wrapped in its yellowed cloth. I brought it down to Adrian's study and set the tiny pink shoe on his desk, in front of him, the way I should have been able to hand it back 6 years earlier, if the world had been kinder. "It belongs with you," I said. It always did. He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he stood and walked down the hall to the room I'd dusted the outside of for 4 years without ever once being allowed inside, and came back holding its twin, the shoe Sophia had sewn with her own hands, buried once inside an empty coffin, retrieved now from the small memorial case where he'd kept it all these years. He set it down beside mine. For the first time in 6 years, the pair was whole. Neither of us said anything. There wasn't anything left that needed saying. I watched him look at those 2 small shoes sitting side by side on his desk, and I understood in that silence that I was witnessing something closer to a wound finally beginning to close than any words could have described. The attic room became a proper guest suite within the month. New windows that actually closed against the winter air, furniture that didn't creak, a name on the door instead of an assumption about what a maid deserved. But I didn't stay in it long. Adrian, once the estate's affairs had settled into something resembling order, asked me to direct something new the Moretti family was funding, a foundation for mothers and children who'd found themselves as frightened and unmoored as that young woman had been on the worst night of my life. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Isabella was still out there somewhere, 18 years old, raised by hands neither of us knew, under a name that wasn't hers by birth. Adrian began searching, quietly and without the fury that might once have driven that search, not for revenge against whoever had raised her, but out of something gentler, a hope he'd finally allowed himself to hold again. Several weeks later, I came into his study to find he'd had both shoes placed together inside a small glass case, positioned beside a photograph of Sophia holding Isabella in the last week of her life. Beneath the case, in Adrian's own handwriting, was a small note. One carried our grief. The other carried our hope. I stood there a long time, looking at it, feeling something in my chest finally loosen after 6 years of believing that one small shoe represented the worst failure of my life. It didn't anymore. It hadn't for a while now, if I let myself admit it. It had simply been waiting, all that time, for someone to understand what it was actually pointing toward. Sometimes the smallest thing left behind is not a reminder of what was lost, but the first clue that everything you believe was gone may still be waiting to come home. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Emma and Adrian's journey is just the beginning. Isabella is still out there, and the search for her is far from over. Subscribe now so you never miss what happens next. Drop a comment telling me which twist shocked you the most. Share this video with someone who loves a good mafia romance. And hit that like button if you believe some families are worth fighting for. See you in the next story.